The irony of Labor Day is that we take the day off. I've always groaned a bit when I've heard this joke, but then I get right back to my barbecue, which is more important, of course. But I was in Exodus the other day, and I realized that Labor Day is exactly what God did in Genesis 1 through 2. Look at this. In Genesis 2, verses 1 through 3, and you're welcome to turn to there in your pew Bible. It should be towards the very beginning. So Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, it says, "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all their multitude, and on the seventh day God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work that he had done in creation." So God made everything, and then took a break to see all the good work he did, and then made it a universal holiday. So Labor Day is really quite a biblical concept. Let's explore how God sees work, and whether this exploration might just make our work something to actually celebrate tomorrow during our barbecues. I know this is a little tricky. Bear with me. So this is another familiar passage, although it's one we don't often preach on. We don't like preaching on the curse. It's really not an upper kind of a message. But in Genesis 3 that Tom just read is the account of the fall of Adam and Eve, and he just read a section of it. There's a serpent tempter, an orchard of delicious fruit, and a forbidden apple. The word doesn't translate. It's not maybe not be an apple. It might be a plum. We don't know. Anyway, most of us remember the story. The first humans, the image bearers of God, are told to take care of their garden, of the garden, and given free range to eat of any of the fruit except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Of course, under the influence of the serpent, Eve and Adam fell prey to the classic blunder of thinking that the grass was greener on the other side. The only thing she wasn't supposed to have, she wanted it. Total classic. And then Adam fell prey to the first case of peer pressure ever, and he got to thinking the same thing. So today's passage happens after God, quote unquote, caught them hiding in the bushes after they ate the forbidden fruit. And this passage is, of course, known as the curse, and in it God gives consequences to the serpent, to Adam, and to Eve. We're not going to look at the serpent's consequences. That's kind of a different sermon. But we're going to look at the curse for Adam and Eve and see what it tells us about work. Now, before we get started, the first thing we have to remember is that Adam and Eve were actually created to work. Right from the beginning, way before the fall, when all was paradise, Adam and Eve were actually working. They weren't out there sipping drinks with umbrellas in them. They were actually doing things, which is actually a good thought for me if I think about, heaven doesn't sound fun if all we do is sit on clouds. There's actually jobs for us to do that will be very fulfilling. At least that's one way of looking at it. So if that gives you comfort, there you go. So they were working. The first thing Adam did was he named the animals. Now, on a little side note, of course, what's the first thing a toddler does, right? A toddler starts naming things. So just kind of interesting. This was the first work given to Adam, and this is the first work that we actually accomplish as babies, before it's really any work at all to us. It's just joy. So in the narrative, Eve was created because God didn't think it was good for Adam to do this by himself. So they had a job to do, really. And they were the image bearers of God and caretakers of the garden. It was work, and it was good. So now we get to Genesis 3, and God is talking about what will happen because of Adam and Eve's sin. And this starts in verse 16 of chapter 3. It says, "To the woman he said, I will greatly increase your pangs in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children, yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. And to the man he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree about which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. So for women, painful childbirth, was that apple really worth it? I don't think so. And men, toil working the ground. So it's actually really interesting if you look at the original language in this section, because the two curses are parallel. It actually says, in toil, to the women, you shall bring forth children. So in toil, and to the men it says, in toil you shall eat of cursed ground. So there's a parallel business here, and that word toil is very present. Certainly a word we don't use that often anymore. So the result of their sin is this toil. What was work became toil. Yeah. So there's a bunch of synonyms for toil that may or may not be helpful, but labor is one of them. So here's our tie into Labor Day. Exerting oneself, slaving away, grinding away, striving, working one's fingers to the bone, or putting one's nose to the grindstone. So as I look at all of us, there are some bleary eyes in the room. Some of us feel that work has definitely shifted into the toil category. And speaking of toil, school is starting, and for our students and children, it's about to begin for 9 months, 9+ months. So they certainly have this work-toil dilemma going on as well. So the world is not the way that God intended it to be. Something changed and made our work toil. It was good, and it became not good. So this is the question: what changed? We often read Genesis 3 as if God is punishing Adam and Eve, like he was mad and wants Adam and Eve to suffer for how bad they were. But you can read a text like that, but you can also read it thinking about God's character of grace and forgiveness. And instead of punishment, I wonder if the so-called curse is actually just a natural consequence. I wonder if it's the natural consequence of the disconnect between us and God, between each other and the world. What if work became toil when we were separated from God? What would that mean for us today? Now, the good news, whenever we read this curse, okay, is that we don't live under this curse anymore. We are New Testament Christians, and by that I mean that Jesus has conquered this curse, and that is actually over and done with, that we can rise above this curse, okay? It says in the passage we read in Galatians, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law. We no longer live unfixably separated from God, the Creator. If work became toil when we were separated from God, then toil can become work again as we connect with our Creator. Work can be redeemed through Christ. And the work that God has for us, the work that is good and not toil, is simply this: any work that shows a piece of God's character or tells a bit of God's story. So that gets back to us being God's image bearers. You know, we are basically, that being said, we are God's hands and feet in the world. We can share God's love with people. We have the capacity to do that because we bear God's image. So I know this is a little bit of a hard sell, because you could say to me, God isn't going to get up for me at 5 a.m. and drive my commute, and he isn't going to make my boss's deadline for me, and he hasn't, fix that whole painful childbirth business either. So I get that. But there are perhaps some practical ways to bring God into our work and to see God in our work in a way that does begin to redeem our work. Now, we all have different experiences with work and kind of relationships to our work. I'm going to simplify this, and some of you may fall in several of these categories, but for simplicity's sake, say there's 3 categories. Those for whom work provides meaning and purpose, those for whom work feels trivial, repetitive, or lacking meaning, and 3, those who feel like they don't have any work. They're underemployed, they could be retired, or unemployed. Now, if you are in category 3, you may not have an official job that you go to on a weekly basis, but work does not have to be employment. I hope that kind of came through in the children's message, that really there's work for all of us to do. A good example of this is child rearing. From our passage, Eve's work was child rearing. Well, I probably don't need to tell you that caring for families is very hard work, but it is easy that as our society kind of leans into what we think of as jobs, we may not take the time to see God in that work of child rearing or whatever God has given you to do, even if it's not formal work. But there's so much God-honoring work that can be done in our homes and in our communities. Another group of us has work that we might consider trivial or repetitive. I had this experience working at Starbucks several years ago. It was definitely not a good fit for me. I kind of always, I dreamed of working at Starbucks as being this great kind of hippie, trendy thing to do, because it was, kind of easy work, and you got to be around interesting people, and you made people happy all day, and you got health insurance. Turns out that, really I was kind of allergic, or at least sensitive to the coffee grounds in the air, so I kind of had a chronic case of pink eye, and my superior was pretty mean and would kind of yell things like, "Put the ice in first." She was very kind of dogmatic about how those drinks were supposed to go together, and I was terribly slow at making them. It was really just about as bad as it gets. And then I worked there right after I'd worked in Michigan as an associate pastor, so I also had this dream of visiting different churches and blogging about them. I thought that would be really interesting, but of course I worked on Sunday, so that didn't work out either. So, I know what it's like to be in these toilsome jobs, and it's hard to see God in them at the time. But I hope that even through that pink eye coffee experience, that somehow there were pieces of God that came through. But good work, no matter where you work or what you do, is showing God's character. Some of us do find purpose and meaning through our jobs. And I think when we do, it's actually harder in some ways to stop and to see God in it, because we're so fulfilled by the actions of our work. So that's a challenge for those of us in that category. Now, some of you may have a fulfilling job, but it's too much of a good thing, right? That's a different sermon, really. That's that whole bit about rest. That would be a completely different sermon. But good news is tomorrow is Labor Day, and that rest, I pray, is coming to you in a day off. There's a book in the Old Testament called Ecclesiastes. This is my conclusion here, which is a book of poetic prose, and it's kind of a downer of a book. Don't read it on a gloomy day. Not a good idea. But here's one of the things that the author writes, and there's a lot of wisdom in this book. He says, "Then I saw that all toil and all skill in work came from a man's envy of his neighbor. This also is vanity and a striving after the wind." And he says this a lot. He kind of says work is striving after the wind. You just can't catch it. It's there's not meaning to it. And then finally, at the end of his book, he concludes, "Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all." So at the end of the day, if we can keep God in this work that God has given us, and the world keeps kind of corrupting it and making it, Hannah gave an awesome face when I said react to work. She's like, oh, the world kind of does that to our work. It's, there's briars and, all kinds of stuff. But there's goodness in it. And that's my prayer for us. Can we find the goodness in it? Can we help each other find the goodness in it? I challenge you to have a conversation with someone today about what is the work that God has put in your life, and where is God in it?